but like a lot of stuff that's made in Japan is very good, cars, etc. And this coffee is very good. So that's my advertisement. Completely unpaid,
Fair
by
enough.
the
There
way,
you
but
go.
I'm enjoying it.
Sponsorship dollars. Apparently, I'm sponsored by Dairy Farmer.
Suntory. Are you connected with Fonterra?
We supply for Fonterra. We wanted to go open country this year, but the big wig in the pool of people who owns the farm said no, effectively, and then everyone else was like, "Oh, sad," because they're not so great. But you know, do what we can.
So going back to the China issue, which we were discussing,
You were telling us
a
about
moment before.
your masters and what you were interested in.
Yes. And I just wanted to quickly connect that with the dairy because I think that's so interesting. I'm going to slightly divert from what I was saying, and I'll definitely come back to it. But can I just ask you, what are the concerns for people in the dairy industry? Let's say if so, we just had an election in Taiwan, and the DPP one, who are the sort of pro sovereignty party, who are not so keen on being close to the mainland. There's a growing chance, according to some analyses, that there could be a war across the strait, like anytime in the next couple of years. New Zealand then suddenly faced a real problem because trade with China over dairy is enormously important. Dairy industry is enormously important in general in terms of the overall economy of New Zealand. What are the concerns that New Zealand just has something where they even just sort of criticise an invasion, and then the dairy industry gets retaliated against? People discussing or planning for?
Well, as far as I can tell in the community, there isn't really any activism or action on this. We feel kind of at the mercy of it, I suppose. All of the protesting and all of the influence at the moment is going towards the water issues. I actually happen to work for the son of the guy who runs Groundswell. Very interesting people, but as far as China goes, it's sort of cross your fingers and hope for the best. Farmers in general are very traditional people. They are not going to be, let's say, pacifist when it comes to conflict with China. They're going to stand up for what's right, regardless of whether it hurts their pocket or not. But everyone's concerned. We had a rough year in the last few months, especially with the storm that happened up north hit our industry quite hard. As Fonterra and Open Country both gave a lot of money to help with that crisis, and that money didn't come out of their pockets, it came out of ours. They just dropped their prices and ate the difference. So lots of people lost their jobs to pay for that.
Wow.
At the moment, far more than I expected, the farmers are very tuned in politically. They've paid real close attention to the last election, as I'm sure can be noted by the results. But I imagine that even though it would financially hurt them, they would be hawkish in general. But sure, we are worried.
It's interesting because, thank you. No, that's just very interesting because I often worry about that scenario. So I've got a fly landing on my screen. I often worry about that scenario because it's sort of like, and I've actually spoken to MFAT officials before, kind of off the record. So I'm not going to go into any great detail, but they seem to indicate that there wasn't, some quipped to me, well, it's getting our bunks if war one happens, and it really could happen in the next couple of years. And then so many assumptions that already are kind of about plain sailing or things continuing as they are that can come with climate change and all the other stuff, lack of social cohesion, and with the stuff. I mean, look at the Red Sea stuff that's happening now. It's quite a careful gambit, whether or not you think it's the Houthis who are doing that from Yemen, are doing it because of Iran. Probably a lot of people do think that. but it's a way of trying to impact global trade and to take out a particular sort of chess piece in a way that's going to stop from people to do the things that they want, essentially. And that is very much going towards the way of geopolitics. There was an MFAT paper declassified through an OIA that came out recently, and they were talking about how the kind of liberal trade-based order, I paraphrase, but this is rough read, is being replaced by a power-based order, where it's about the ability to sort of carrot and stick it using hard power rather than, if you like, soft power. And that's going to make, especially with shocks like an invasion of Taiwan, the world a much more coercive. And I think it's going to be pretty rough for small countries like New Zealand. That's one of the things that I worry about.
The sense that comes to mind for me.
So I didn't see.
Just interrupt. Sorry. Regarding the dairy industry in particular, and New Zealand in general as well, losing China or having interruptions to trade with China would be certainly disruptive. But given the relatively balanced and constrained nature of the global food market, like there's not massive surpluses. If China stopped taking our product, they'll have to take someone else's. And there's going to be someone who wants food. And it would certainly interfere with the margins and make things difficult as new arrangements are made and politics works itself out. And the more marginal producers quite possibly would go under, the dairy farms that only just break even because they're in very marginal land. But I feel like we're in a reasonable position because there's always going to be people who want food.
As far as exports go, it's pretty reasonable. It's not grain and, well, I suppose it could be made to cheese, so that's a big deal. But it's not. We're not exporting iPhones here. That's something that people will still need in desperate times. To your point about the change from soft to hard power, it's been coming for a real long time. We've been living in this lie telling us that war is over, that everyone's peaceful and nice now because we're all enlightened and better than all of our ancestors. And it's not the case. And worse still, we've been feeding what is it effectively the modern day Nazis with all of our money and infrastructure and intellectual property for 30 years now? We rely on them for everything.
Modern day Nazis?
The CCP. That's my reference to there. Yeah, like we buy all their shit. Everything in this room was probably made there, which means they have all the manufacturing, which means that we're giving them all of our money. And we're sitting around here arguing about how much we should be giving to this poor minority or that, or whatever margins on some business, all the while they're building more frigates. We're going to end up in a hard power situation because we have a hard power player. Like that, you're not going to win any other way.
Yeah.
And we're not willing to make the sacrifices to win through economic means. No one in the West is willing to give up what they have in order to cut off China.
And I hear a lot of very conflicting opinions on the military might of the West. Like there's some who say, here's the number of tons of ship that America has versus China. Here's the fancy electronics, or like no one can see the F-22, or we've got all these missile systems that no one else can touch, and so on. And then you hear from other perspectives that the standards and the training that people have to meet in order to pass in basic training are being dropped, and marksmanship's being dropped, and all these standards are dropping because they can barely retain anyone. They're massively understaffed and under resourced on the ground level. Like the high-tech R&D stuff seems to get tons of money, but the ground level, we need new boots level seems massively understaffed, or we need a computer to do our paperwork, and
we don't have enough people. We don't have enough men, military men, to be specific. And China has an abundance, an absolute abundance of men.
One of the things That's true, and they've got a very internally competitive labour drawn towards the military as a potentially high status job and one that's reasonably well paying. Whereas you can make the argument that, in more privileged countries, a lot less people want to do, join the military for whatever reason. When I was in America, relatively briefly, but it's quite interesting how they treat the military at airports and things like that. They kind of given this very special status, and I don't have anything against that, but it was just there is still, I think, in the US, not so much in the UK, a sense that that the military are highly honoured. I would say that they still have really excellent, talented people, but the numbers don't match up. The technological advantage seems to still be there, but the gap is relatively narrow, and the gap is relatively narrow because of the enormous, like it's been. Describe it as a transfer of wealth and history, possibly measurably, what's the word for it, empirically, in terms of the scale of that. And that's one of the things I think in terms of the kind of asymmetries that's very, very hard to combat. You've got, on the one hand, you've got democracies where you've got dissent. There are lots of ways for an open society, or if you like, an open source society, to go and get inside its mechanisms, try and screw with its operating system, if you like, which was a good analogy that was used by somebody who I was reading, Leonard Nashmeyer, who's a Swiss sociologist, I think. That's how he described the 2016 Russian election experience. They've also got the ability to be able to combine various sort of force multiplying aspects of their military and their covert operations and all of that. But what they don't have, I think, at the same time, is legitimacy internationally. And I think you're seeing a coalition, a balancing coalition, the classic mold of balance of power, realist politics around the world. Even the Philippines was sort of going one way or the other. It wasn't entirely clear, clearly now on the US's side. So there are two things about that. I mean, one, in a sense, balance of the power make us more secure. It's just the reality that the idea, like you were saying earlier, that the sort of the liberal myth that trade will, sort of globalize you or something like that, isn't sort of hasn't really borne itself out. We live in a very, very complex world with a lot of fragile points at which sort of disruptions can occur with cascading effects and so on. But from the realist perspective, if you do have balancing coalitions, it does make things a lot safer in terms of the old idea of Thucydides' trap, when you have a rising power versus a revisionist power versus a established power. Normally, some massive earthquake, war, whatever happens, and we managed to avoid direct confrontation in the Cold War. It's not guaranteed now. A couple of things. Sorry, I am meandering a lot, but there was a couple of things that are interesting though in terms of looking at the economics. The what's classically referred to as the correlation of forces in the from the Marxist perspective. It's what the Soviets used to talk about the West. What's the correlation of forces in this respect? What's the correlation of forces in that respect? How can we leverage that? Apparently, the ratio of China's economy, remembering that it has something like 4 times the population size of the US, is declined to about 2/3 or slightly above, whereas it was in the 70% plus region. So America still has an enormous amount of power to really hit the economy hard. And the interesting thing there, and I do think about what you're saying about farmers earlier, that whether it'll be a similar thing there where people are willing to take that sacrifice, well, it'll be imposed on them anyway, right? So it'll be the CCP side. And whether the CCP assesses that it's in its best interest, they're just in economic decline and it's not going to go away. And so the best thing that they can do is to seize the vanishing opportunity to take a fairly defiantly independent Taiwan. Which then means that they have the ability to project power into the Western Pacific, which they've been preconditioning for some time, it seems. So, I mean, creating massive debt, in various countries, scoping out for places. It seems now quite evident for potential PLA bases that can be used later on. But I think they are quite inherently cautious because they're smart, and so if they're it's anybody's guess about what they would do. I think they probably thought that the Russian invasion would be over quicker, and that would change the game somewhat.
They
So
did
one of the
find
things that I worry
as
about
far as
is
we can tell.
what they are doing. Definitely. So the Financial Times, for example, with their, in effect, they were showing from one of their wonderful graphs, which beautifully visualizes, the different data which have their own clear message. What they were saying there was that you can see that they're providing them an absolute lifeline. So they are on economic life support from China. And one of the reports that came out, again, you can't independently verify this, but it was from a reputable publication, although I forget which. They were saying that Putin allegedly promised Xi, I think this was coming from American intelligence officials who had intercepted it in some manner, allegedly told Xi that he would keep. It's true.
Sorry, you're cutting it out.
There.
Do you want to go over what Xi and Putin were saying to each other again? You've cut out for that bit.
Yes, no problem. So there was a reputable publication which reported American intelligence, obviously taking American intelligence officials themselves with a grain of salt, but that they had intercepted some communication between Xi and Putin, where Putin had promised to keep the Ukraine war going for 5 years, at least. And so what that suggests is an attempt to exhaust Western support, divide the West primarily between Europe and North America and its other allies in terms of its support for Ukraine, and then you might get to sort of max out the ability, the invasion of Taiwan, to max out the ability of the US to respond to various problems. But then, of course, you see Guyana might get invaded by Venezuela any day. What's going on in the Red Sea could last years. Perhaps that's the point, right? And then the regionalization of the conflict in the Middle East. Then the Straits of Hormuz could get shut down, right? I mean, it's quite possible that there could be cooperation between
one of the big things. Axis, if you like. One of the big things that's top of mind for me regarding the influence on this whole spectrum of events, I just saw a cordial debate online, you could say, between Doomberg and Chris Bartonson on peak prosperity. I think I would discuss this with you when I saw you last, Emmanuel. But the basics was Doomberg, I'm not sure of his specifics, but he's a reasonably prominent blogger, put out something saying that basically peak cheap oil is a myth. We'll have cheap oil for the rest of our lifetimes, as much as we want, essentially. And Chris Martinson from Peak Prosperity was arguing the opposite side, that no, here are graphs, here are numbers and so on that say no, it's peaking. And the final analysis that he'd drawn from a few other people, so not necessarily his analysis, but it's like, here are several analyses that seem to agree on this. Ballpark figures, by 2040, global production will be down by 12 million barrels a day. The global production of total liquids is about 100 million barrels a day. Crude and condensate is about 80 million barrels a day. So that's about 12% of total barrel of oil equivalents. And at the same time, that's going to... the US shale boom is showing various signs of peaking. Like you zoom in and it's down to only a few counties where the growth remains in shale oil production, and they're showing signs of peaking. And so if they peak, then the whole lot's peaked. And there's a whole bunch of reasoning behind it that he presents, but 2025 was the not quite shit have hit the fan moment that he was pointing out, but the people realise there's problems, because that was sort of the peak, and then it's like stuff starts being noticeable then in an undeniable way. And as America want to import more, as their export capability drops off and they can't meet their local supply of what they can produce, then that'll strain the global market and they'll be paying more. So you'll have internal politics in the US because they want to keep their current lifestyle. and they're likely to go out wanting more oil, and at the same time other places are going to be saying, no, we want it because we don't have enough either. And China's been seeing this coming for a while because they're that long-term view. Even if Xi gets knocked over, they tend to, they culturally have the long view, from their long history of being able to look back 1,000 years. And it's going to be an interesting thing to see how it all plays out. And as a little country down the bottom of the world, it's going to be, we hope that people out on top are friendly with us. But then again, we're not really enemies with anyone, and we make food. So it's kind of like,
we also have no defensive capabilities whatsoever and a large amount of resources that we haven't tapped, including oil and a massive gold vein that was just found recently. Both of which China has said they own without asking recently.
What?
And they're floating the idea of sending frigates down here or something. This is not an official thing that I've heard. It's something I heard through the farmers who were talking about it. But very recently, I know that there's a massive gold vein that was just discovered, and then we have oil off the coast on both sides down here. Ridiculous amounts. And we are a ridiculously vulnerable country. Very, very strategically advantageous to take. If they have Taiwan, if they have the Pacific Sea, they can come down and take us. They're not going to get any resistance. And then they have a staging point for Australia and all the way through up that whole region. We are we're the only thing in the way between them and the American side through the other channels. We are actually in a really strategically important position, and it's concerning. In terms of where things are going, there's infinite details on every front. Like everyone's talking about Russia and Ukraine, but that history goes back an absurdly long way with a lot of complicated interminglings and influence from internal and external sources. Not to mention what the United States has done recently that triggered a lot of this, and then funding from other nations, and then the geopolitical play. It's hard to say what is going to happen, but it's very easy to point and say, okay, it's going to get hot at some point. It has in local places, and it's going to get hot globally at some point. As far as I can tell, unless the regime crumbles from within, China's regime, there will have to be a collective wipe them from the planet attitude like we did in World War II. This is not like the Cold War. You can say what you like about the communist systems. They weren't super overt about going out and taking over the whole planet. They had cultural influence, for sure, and that was a problem. But they weren't actually aiming at global domination the same way that the Germans were. And the CCP is explicitly and actively doing that with crimes against humanity on a large level that we all conveniently ignore while we buy their shirts and everything else made by often the people who are being abused. It'll come to a point of the choice. Do we allow the evil to go on to benefit ourselves financially? Or do we go and destroy them? And this is the great tragedy that we've set ourselves up in. If you could imagine the analogy for World War II, it would be as if everything that the Western Allies used on a daily basis was produced in Germany while they were taking over Poland. And then everyone was paying attention to some little skirmish in the Pacific to try and distract it. Sacrifice will have to be made somewhere. And the question is, are we going to be willing, or are we going to be dragged kicking and screaming because China did it before we were ready to head them off? In terms of Taiwan, I do not think that we're going to let them have it. I think if they go for that, and I'm pretty sure China knows, it'll be all-out hot war straight away. I don't think the United States is going to tolerate that at all. And I think they're waffling about it to try and maintain some kind of facade, but I'm pretty sure that one's clear. My big question in all of this, and it's something that I don't think enough people are paying attention to, is what the hell is India going to do?
I was thinking about them.
A few years ago, I was working at a restaurant in Christchurch, and I happened to work with an ex-Air Force pilot from the Indian Air Force. Really interesting guy. He was just hanging out down here, escaping the world. And he was telling me about the culture, and particularly the military culture over there. And they hate China with an absolute passion. But they're really annoyed at why the West isn't allying with them properly. They've got, 1 billion people and more money than you'd expect in a reasonable military, which I think they rolled out recently for, while I was talking to him, for, it's like Pakistan or something. Sent a single missile over the border, and they sent an obscene amount of tanks to that border in like half a day. They're ready to mobilize, and we're sitting over here in the West pretending they don't exist for some reason.
And the Nepalese contingent on the border. Yeah, they've got the very, very motivated Nepalese division really just wanting to charge over the border to take back Nepal.
Yeah. And that would be great. I mean, I think that was my first influence to world politics when I was a kid. So I was a massive fan of Tibet. When I was, a very young kid, and I wanted to be a monk and all of this, and then I think I was 8, and someone told me that China had invaded and taken over Tibet, and I was heartbroken. I didn't understand how that could be a thing, and particularly how everyone was so okay with it. And as far as I'm aware, they effectively wiped out everyone, and no consequences for that. Whatever game the West is playing, it's willing to sacrifice for it. So I better bloody hope they have a good plan. But I do believe that the West is playing for keeps. I don't think that they're going to let this happen. At least I hope.
I think there are some good developments, from the perspective of counterbalancing. So, I mean, through that, Japan are very capable, especially naval power, and they've got serious things to lose if Taiwan gets invaded. So they've got the Senkaku Islands, which are just like, I mean, apparently you can see from some of the Senkaku Islands, Taiwan on a good day. So they're in a position where they're really, really close, and they are going to be basically the PLAN, the Chinese Navy, is going to be right up India's arse if they invade Taiwan. So that's a big threat, and it really makes Japan less secure. So Japan are very serious about it, and they're a very capable country, notwithstanding the fact they've got economic problems with lots of debt. But they've got a fantastic manufacturing base, which is a great asset. They've got extremely impressive work ethic, and they're very experienced. They're an important ally. India are part of the Quad. I mean, one of the interesting things is there were a couple of points of tension within that union. So the Quad is India, China, Australia, and the United States. One of them is that India's relationship with Russia is a complicating factor, because essentially the West and Russia are basically, that's it. Completely. There isn't going to be a rapprochement there, I think, for a generation.
It's a bit of a waste, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, the problem there is I see people like John Mearsheimer talking about, like, saying, "Oh, we've wasted the opportunity to ally with Russia." It's like, yes, of course, but it takes two to tango. I mean, it looks like Russia was never really. I mean, how open were they? To be able to be close to the West. I mean, they're still doing all kinds of stuff. I think that obviously went after about 2007. And that's the argument that Mearsheimer probably makes as well, which is that with Georgia, Georgia was liberalized. I mean, it was part of this idea that, the wave of liberalization and westernization, if you like, was going to keep on spreading, and the Russians felt so threatened by that, they basically Georgia, and now their poor president is sitting in jail, starving. Yeah, it's very, very hard to turn that one back, and I don't think it's going to happen unless something drastically changes. I mean, Russia's so geopolitically important, despite having a pretty poor economy. Yeah, I mean, the ideal would be that it would be a major piece of the puzzle, but they really do want to have strategic autonomy, and so I think privately they're deeply frightened of China as well, right? And so somebody like Dugin, who's one of the great sort of, if you like, court philosophers for Putin, he actually openly wrote in one of his books that Russia has to destroy China. So who knows what will happen there?
They have had history of conflict on the border, haven't they? Seem to remember.
Yes, and you had the Sino-Soviet split as well, which was and so there isn't, it's complex, and you've got Siberia, which okay, it might be freezing, but it's strategically important, and there's lots of things there, and it's very empty, and it's it's
freezing for now
as climate change.
Exactly.
So it's,
that'd be really useful.
And there are people might bring back the mammoth and put it there. Literally, that you can actually just branch off wildly. Somebody was thinking about doing a Jurassic Park thing with a mammoth. I don't just mean some random guy on a park bench or something. I mean, someone serious was talking about it, and you can do it by mixing it with elephant sort of DNA, and
that was on
awesome.
Rogan. I'm pretty sure they've already done it with a different species. I forget which one it was that they did first. But elephant was next up for mammoths. But there was a different species they tried out first. I can't remember off the top of my head.
If you had the chance, would you ride a mammoth like you would an elephant?
Well, my brain immediately says yes. Would I ride an elephant? Yeah, probably. Yes. Yeah, why not? Yeah. I don't see why not. There's another one of those things that is like we've been talking a lot about, well, upcoming world global tensions, and then the concerns we have around energy, oil production, manufacturing, and while we're on the list of doomsday things, we can throw population collapse in there as well. Hooray. And then there's the fiat system and all of that as well, which is great. But there are a hell of a lot of massive positive things coming around the pike at the exact same time. And that makes things very interesting. Like everything could go depending on how we behave. I feel like we're at the tipping point, which could go very awful or very great. Genetic engineering on a level that we haven't seen before, DNA printing, things like this could be great or horrible depending on how you go about it. And then you've got the AI revolution that's coming through, and just hidden behind that, although I think the public hasn't paid too much attention yet, is robotics are about to hit in a way that is, I don't think we're ready for, in the same way we've been ready for the AI problem. And then I think energy is going to see a massive explosion in new technology soon as well. So we've got all of these things bubbling behind the surface at the same time as we have all of this chaos bubbling. And the question of, what's going to happen, what's the outcome going to be, is, I think it's not known. It'll come down to, do you think we're going to have a good future or a bad future? And I think that itself is going to come down to, do you have faith in humans or not? Because we won't be able to predict what's happening. There's so many things emerging that are changing. Like any one of these conditions is world changing. And we have like 50 of them showing up at once. And it's all going to, and then you can't predict any of it too, because then you have your old centralization problem. Decentralized networks of compute effectively are going to be far more efficient because there's far more compute. And my reference is to humans, I mean. So what is going to happen to determine the future of humanity is going to depend on billions of human beings' individual choices. How do we know? Are people going to be good enough to pass whatever the hell is happening, or are people going to fall to the lesser side? I'm concerned because of what we've done with mobile phones. It was like the first contact with one of these emerging technologies. And as a tool that can be used in any different way, some for amazingly good, and most people do not use it for that. It's been wasted in a lot of ways, underutilized. I mean, it's a concerning prelude.
I get a strong feeling that I can't justify, but instinct, shall we say, that the experience, because that's a very personal thing. It's not a measurable thing. It depends on your preconceptions, your expectations, your plans, your physical and emotional preparedness for whatever turns up. The experience of individuals in this coming chaotic time, which I think that much is quite certain, that it is chaotic times we're looking at.
High leverage time.
Yes, exactly. Like it's not just chaos, it's tipping points, and tipping points imply a little bit of force has a massive outsized impact. And I feel like those who are swept along with the current most obliviously will be swept down a whirlpool, so to speak. But at the same time, the line between going down the whirlpool and going up the waterfall, for want of a better metaphor, is very narrow. Like, you just need to realize there's a difference and start striving in one direction. And the sooner you start getting a hang of yourself, and I'm not saying there is a right answer, but as with many of our previous discussions, I strongly feel that it's the better put together you can make yourself, and the less likely to sit in shock at unexpected developments.
Or turn a blind eye.
Yeah, or turn a blind eye. The more likely you are to be able to respond constructively. And there's a analogy or process that Chris Martinson describes of the adjustment reaction. I imagine you're driving down the road and you see a large shape coming towards the side of the road. You initially think, thing to swerve around or something. Initially, there's that shock response. And then if you think, no, I'm on a road, I keep going straight, then you run into the cow. If you swerve, you think, oh, that was too much, I shouldn't swerve that much. And then you think, oh, thank God I swerved around it. But it's like there's those three stages. There's the, oh God, what's this? There's the, oh no, I overreacted. Oh no, that was just enough. So there's the, like, seeing in the first months of COVID, before it became mainstream, when everyone was ignoring it basically, except for those who noticed it and were saying, this is a problem. The people who started buying up masks as a reasonable sort of, I think that's a good thing, like, I don't want to catch it, I don't know what will prevent it, like a mask is something, or stored some water, or stockpiled a little bit of food, were the people who a month later were saying, oh, I think I overreacted. And then a few months after that, we're looking at people fighting over toilet paper and saying, oh, okay, yeah, that was about right. Or the people who, for multiple years, have had a garden and, in preparation for the chaos we're talking about, and their neighbours had laughed at them. And then COVID hit, and suddenly the neighbours were asking them how to do it. Because what looked at first like an overreaction turned out to be almost an underreaction, because it's like, is the food still going to be there? And okay, it wasn't that bad. But it also comes down to if you see a potential threat and you decide to ignore it, if you're right that it was a nothing burger or whatever, then you're fine. If you react and it turns out to be nothing, then you've spent some resources, panicked unnecessarily, and so on. Big shame. On the other hand, if it turns out to be a real thing and you prepared, you're okay.
This is what we talked about last week, isn't it? Which was the there's the balance of probability of which outcome is going to happen, but there's also the downside. If the downside on the very small chance it's going to happen thing is like death, it is weighted way higher as something to prepare for, regardless of how small the chance is. You can't just go, oh, this is unlikely, and then not prepare. A little bit of attention and preparation will go a long way, and you have to pay attention to the risk assessment, the cost of the downside in case the unlikely thing happens. And if the cost is immense, you better be bloody careful about it.
Yes.
I think another thing to point out here is something been bouncing around in my head, a quote that I heard from someone, which was, for too long we've been the human animals, and it's about damn time we become the human beings. We live in this brain of impulses and desires and reactions, and we have the ability to be consciously attentive and to make conscious choices. And I have a strong sense that if we allow ourselves to be the human animals, if we just listen to our drives and our reactions, that we won't make it through this time. I think the only way through is to actually pay attention and to not be emotionally reactive, or to not live in your chemistry. You could take it in a spirituality way if you'd like, whatever makes us different from the animals. But if we don't embrace that, the thing that makes us the most special, at what point, there we go. As technology ever increases, so does the leverage that an individual has. If we run off our caveman brain chemistry forever, eventually the leverage will be so high that all it takes is a button push to end humanity. And some caveman will push it. But we are human beings. We have the ability to be conscious and attentive and to rise above our nature. As the technology and the leverage that comes from it ever increases, the requirement for being a conscious being separated from the endorphins and chemicals that run our body becomes infinite to the point of being a requirement. So perhaps that's the Fermi great filter.
It doesn't even rely on in our immediate future, it doesn't even rely on a technological progress assumption there, because if we're looking at an inflection point in society as a whole, peak oil, socio-political global change, AI, whatever, if we're looking at an inflection point, then that's the force multiplier, because it's like...
you get cultural force multipliers too. I feel like this is your I'm not so sure that things will keep going upwards comment.
Well, it's basically, but it's your point is valid whether or not it does.
Okay.
My
thoughts, even in small force, it would still make a difference. Is that what you're going for?
Yes.
Right. It's still the best path forward regardless.
Do
whether
what
big
is
force or small.
Yeah, do what you feel will make the most difference, and do what's meaningful.
And pay attention.
Take it in.
Don't act just because.
Yeah.
I think there's some degree of a sort of back to basics line where people are being forced to confront a new reality will give people meaning. It will. I mean, if you look at what happened with the earthquake here, I mean, there were disgusting things where there were people robbing old ladies, but there was a lot of and with the terror attacks, the response was pretty good. I think New Zealand, having come from the UK, which has a pretty mixed, depending on where you are in Britain, kind of vibe in terms of how people are going to deal with massive social pressures. I think New Zealand's actually got a pretty good scorecard so far, and they've got a potential. Especially probably in places like where you are, Hamish. I think there's a resilience there, and that people would work to help each other. There's also a tradition, and these things come back because people fall on, those strong threads, and the tradition of mateship, which is also very strong in Britain, but also parts of Britain, parts of Australia, Canada, and so on, where there's kind of code where you go and help your neighbour. It's kind of the decent thing to do, and if you break that code, it's a big no-no. But also, you kind of you have a certain degree of self-reliance. all those things can come back to the fore, and I think that's not going to be a negative thing entirely. I think the problem is in the cities and in other places, and particularly for the vulnerable, and this is something I care about. Because I've got a brother with diabetes type 1, my kids have got, on the autism spectrum, and it's going to be very, very problematic for the vulnerable. And so the primary thing that stands out for me is, prepare, find some way of preparing. Can you rely on government totally to do that? No, I mean, the governments aren't gods. There are ways in which, communities can organise their own sort of autonomous networks, hopefully on some level. Becoming a lot more, like ideally, you mentioned India earlier on, Hamish. One of the great things about India is that they are able to produce generic copies of drugs, and they just defy the American IP stuff, which I actually like when it comes to medications, because they're able
And
to save lives.
we have to do that here. We do
Right.
that.
Well,
somewhat.
look, I mean,
we do it pretty reasonably, as far as I can
being
tell, but
medicine
not as far
secure
as India.
Yeah, I mean, India can thumb its nose that much more because it's big.
They're nuclear power, aren't they?
Size massive. They are certainly a nuclear power, and Pakistan. Pakistanis actually got then, I think, were helped by the Americans, because India, to get the nuclear stuff up and running, partly to balance out against India, but that was the big theory during the Cold War, that India would align itself with the communists, because they were pretty pro-Soviet, especially under Indira Gandhi, and there's a lot of intemperate language, if you might call it that, which you can hear on the recordings of Nixon talking to various aides and Kissinger about their attitudes towards Indira Gandhi. But one of the shameful things about America's relationship with Pakistan, just to branch off very, very briefly, was during the 1971 War of Independence for Bangladesh, and I've been to Bangladesh, they don't forget it there. The Pakistanis basically committed the genocide in what was East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. And the Americans supported them diplomatically and otherwise. So, and it was the Indians who actually intervened in that. So that's a pretty bad some of the tensions in the past. But anyway, yeah, India is a really interesting country. Yeah.
It'll make a big difference on the world stage, one way or the other.
One quick point on India that I've heard is pre-European or British colonisation of India, they were basically the richest country on earth. And from what I understand, their literacy rate was near 100%. They were relatively educated. They had not utopia, because that doesn't exist, definitely, but they'd found a good balance in many ways. It's a very spiritually focused nation, or nation in the sociological sense, not in the borders sense. The nation of the people of India are more spiritually aware than many Western countries.
Very religious people.
Yeah, but not this religion religious, more lots of religions religious.
Anything better than nothing.
Yeah. And so many different languages. It's an extraordinarily diverse place, but at the same time, I think their IQ, if you test it and normalize it and so on, Indian IQ is up a few notches relative to Western IQ. It's like they've got some heritage from all of that. And like their space program is the most money efficient on Earth, and there's pictures of someone transporting rocket parts on the back of a bicycle. And only in India. But there's a reason they used to be the richest country on earth, or at least right up there. And the people who did that, the nation that did that, is still there. And so that may be the counterbalance to China, because India's a long way behind China in the population decline curve. Like China's population's already declining, India's is still growing. It will decline in time, but I'm
hoping that countries later on down the line will learn the lesson before rather than inevitably following the same curve, you can learn from others' mistakes. And I think there's going to be a cultural on that one.
Sorry. India's GDP is about 3 to 4 trillion. which obviously, if it was a country the size of the population of Russia, which is around 200 million, rather than 1.4 billion, would be looking a lot better. But China's is several times larger than that. I think they're about 17 trillion or something like that. So it's still, gross GDP is a big measure of how you pack your punch in the international game. PPP GDP, purchasing power parity is more of a measure of relative sort of average wealth inside the country. But in terms of their gross economic power, they're not up there yet. But their growth's good, demographics are good, they've got a strong workforce. The problem going forward, one of the big problems there is water and then temperature. So they've got an enormous population, they need clean water. A lot of the rivers come from Tibet, the Tibetan glaciers on the plateau there, and that's under China's control. So if they want to dam them, with huge effort, or they, find some way to sort of engage in water resource warfare, strategically, however they might do that, that could put enormous pressure on India. So that's a big worry. You've muted yourself. I see.
Yeah. It's interesting how. I imagine it's very hard to project, but you seem very in touch with what's going on geopolitically, far more than me. I don't know about Michael here, but I don't pay attention to any news anymore, and I haven't for quite a while, effectively since I came down here to escape the city. Everything seems to be heating up from what I hear. Pardon?
Sorry, why is that? Because I know that there is a crisis of trust in the media. I wondered if that was
well, yeah. That's part of it. That's part of it, but mostly just mental health. I am way happier not paying attention, and when major things happen in the world, I hear about them from other people. Friends will tell me, or workmates will tell me about something that's happened. But I think, a really good way to be miserable is to be super well informed about all the horrible things that's going on while doing nothing about them. While it is good to be informed, I think it's probably better for the average person to simply have a decent dose of skepticism for all sources and just prepare for something going wrong. Obviously, we need some people
the other thing is,
on the money, but
I don't know if you had it. I had it the other day. Of course you've had this. Sorry, but times when you go through sudden severe physical pain, for example, and it just massively sharpens your focus, and you start to really appreciate what you have, and you go to yourself, why do I waste my time worrying? Or if you had a near-death experience where you've nearly died and you realise that life is for living, that kind of thing. And so I get completely what you're saying. I'm definitely spend way too much time, looking at these things. I've developed a certain degree of detachment now, and the very practical focus on looking after my children sort of governs my day, and things.
That's a hell of a why to carry you through it.
Yes, because but it also gives me an investment in terms of thinking about, like, on the one hand, frankly, I think New Zealand's got a really good chance of facing the future well. I think this is a really good country. I've been to quite a few, and I like this one a lot. I think it's got a hell of a chance, and it's got a lot of things going for it. And I guess one of the things that stands out for me is some of the media is very short term. That's a problem. There aren't sort of, if you like, podcasts talking about big long term issues, and the media cycle and business cycle, dominate things. It's a fortunate part of modern life. But I just, we have a lot to lose, and we have a lot to protect, a lot to conserve. I'd like to see more of a national conversation about that. There are people in America, right? Genuinely, who talk about. It's a joke, but it's also true about the possibility of rebooting world civilization from New Zealand, because it's going to be one of the few viable places. You've got these rich billionaires coming out here. So yeah, I'd love to see more of a national conversation about that with experts and people from a diverse range of fields talking about that. And I'm interested to hear what farmers, might be discussing among
I feel New
themselves,
Zealand.
about that, because they're in a position to do something.
I think the biggest problem in New Zealand politics, as far as I can tell, is that there doesn't seem to be like an underground pirate radio kind of influence on the political culture. You want to know about politics in New Zealand, you have effectively the national official sources, and that's about it. There isn't any, I don't know, like Timcast for New Zealand. There isn't anything like that at all. It's just picking one out of a hat. There's like 50,000 for American politics. And particularly for people my age, for my generation, those who were at all interested in politics, all of us paid attention to United States politics. And no one paid attention to this country. Particularly in the last few elections, they were big and they were paid attention. No one cared what happened here. And very few still do. You have a massive demographic problem when it comes to New Zealand politics, and to be entirely frank, you want the younger people to have a greater influence at the moment. We are and have been corrupted in a lot of ways by social media and other problems. But I think as far as generations on average go, we're pretty damn well informed as we grew up with the internet. And we're all paying attention and
corrupted and immunized.
Yeah. Talk about a healthy dose of skepticism.
Mm.
We're all focused on the culture war, it seems. And I can see why, without explicitly knowing it. We had the politics is downstream from culture thing. And our generation seems to have jumped on that real hard, for good and bad. But we have lent more in an opposing force than the previous generation, which is great. Something I like to rub in the face with my boss and Michael every chance I get. But there's something lacking in the conversation here. It's very official. It's very much the lies fit to print. And there's very few of the sort of background lifting or pulling back the curtain. I've seen a few. I have seen a few started, especially in the last couple of years. But they haven't got as much traction. And I think that's perhaps because we haven't been people aren't really interested in what happens in the politics for this country because they don't seem to think it matters on a global stage. And I think that's the problem with the internet and the global mindset. It's hard to think local when you're thinking about the Ukraine war or China or the potential civil war in America or whatever it is you're paying attention to. Those problems seem so much bigger than, the farming sector in your local country.
Your comment about think local is interesting. Just in terms of a catchphrase that I've seen a lot in sustainability circles of think global, act local, which loses the local personalization. Like if you're focused on your own township, as if you go back to the 50s or 70s, as was more the case, then the encouragement to think global, be aware of the global issues, and then act locally to solve them. It's like you're already aware of the local issues. But these days, the thinking globally has taken precedence, and so it's more a case of the need to think local again. And as with so many things, it was a factor of its time rather than a absolute panacea. It was a counterbalance to the situation of that time. We need a different counterbalance now, and things constantly develop.
I think there's a real problem with the think global statement. When you're thinking about the global world, it's impossible for you to think communally. It's you and the world. It's very individualist. It's very much I'm alone in a city mindset, but I'm thinking about the species. And one thing I've really noticed since moving out here, having people around who you know, who talk to you, who influence you, actually pushes your behavior in good directions. Like local people wanting you to keep your section tidier, whatever, just as an off the ballpark example, or what's happening on farm. There's influences there of, actually, no, we want to keep our area clean. This is our little town and we like to keep it the way that we like to keep it. Even socially, be nice, be courteous, go out, behave in the certain ways that we expect. A little bit of influence on the behavior is good, but when you live in the city and you're sitting alone in your apartment or never seeing your neighbours or any of this, you can be as much of a slob as you like. You can throw as much as you like in the rubbish because they just come and collect it. What do you care if your neighbour sees you? They don't matter. You don't know them. But everyone here knows everyone. Someone walks past your house and you're doing something that's unsavory, everyone knows immediately, especially with social media. Anything that happens in this town, everyone knows, which has its downsides. But I think in a lot of ways has actually been really good for us in particular, but just for people. You can't survive in an environment with a community and be like an individualist narcissist. You just get excised immediately.
Yes, and it's actually harmful for you in the long run as well if you do that. If you're constantly being self-indulgent in one way or another. I've got friends. Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, if you've got the various network of obligations, but you've got. I mean, that is the way that human beings live for years. I mean, for thousands of years, we lived in semi-agrarian sort of. I mean, my ancestors would have been, and I've discovered this through genealogy, Irish and Yorkshire people, living in a small village outside of Sheffield in one case, and then County Cork in the other. And you would have had your network of people, and there was a sense of mutual obligation. There was friendship. There were fallings out, and then people made up, like having families, and all that's incredibly healthy and perfectly natural. And then when you're tuned into all of this stuff, when you're in a city, and having lived in London, I can very much vouch for this. The effect that it has on you mentally can be pretty devastating. And it's weird to feel so lonely in such a crowded place. Also, I mean, the amount of mental health problems that are there in somewhere like London, I saw, and this is a genuine observation I had. I saw it's quite comical. A man at one point, this is in East London, with a hand puppet, like a sock puppet in one hand, and then drinking from a can of beer in the other, and then talking to a sock puppet like that. So that was quite an amazing thing to see. But I mean, it wasn't that unusual because people go about. I mean, there would be murders, almost every day in one part of the Bethnal Green or the wider borough that I was in, and it would just happen. These things would happen. So it's it kind of desensitizes you to things that you shouldn't be desensitized to. I think on one level, and social media is doing that as well.
I think there's a real problem with. It's almost bringing up a problem with freedom in a certain way. I mentioned this, like the community's constraining me, and I can't behave in certain ways because I'll get social shame. I'm not legally constrained. I can still be a total ass legally, but there's something about being socially constrained, and the old part of me, the very libertarian part, was immediately cropping up, going like, "Oh, this is infringing on your rights to behave how you like." And it's like, well, do you really have the liberty to be an asshole? Should you? Like, yeah, you do, but should you really?
Well, you have the liberty to do so, and the liberty to receive the consequences.
Yeah, like we don't need that, and yeah, I can already feel the whatever you want to call it, part of me cropping up and going like, oh, there's an argument against free speech, or that you're sounding very socialist there. It depends on where the constraints come from.
Absolutely.
Cultural constraints
can
be great if it's a good culture. But if it's terrible culture, that's bad. And if it's government constraints, that's also bad. You can have a nuanced opinion. It's not liberty always good all the time. I can be, an asshole streaking down the street in front of children. It's like, no, actually you can't.
Was
that quote from, what is it? A libertarian is a conservative who hasn't had kids yet. They're like, I can do anything I want. no matter where I
Exactly.
go, and kids be like, Jesus, I don't want someone like that around my kids. You can go do it at your house, not in the library. Thank you.
There was a
Yes, I
perspective
mean it's
on interdependence that just 2 cents worth that I saw, that if you compare us biologically to every other animal, human children, especially infants, are a disastrous failure of survivability. Right, you look at an infant within the first year. If you stopped interacting with that child is dead.
Yeah.
But you look at a horse; they're walking within minutes, and within weeks or months, they're semi-independent. Give them a year, and then they could probably live if mum died and go off and run with the herd and so on. You have a human, you've got this massive dependency period, and so the result of that is that our social integration into the social whole is not just a nice to have. It is very explicitly on the same level as air and water and food. It is survival. And then
It's
as you grow
requirement
up,
for human
yeah,
condition.
it's different when you're an adult because you can go out and survive on your own to a large degree. And there are adults who like to go out in the wilderness and not see another human for months on end. But that's not the majority, and most people will go mad. Like, there's a reason why solitary confinement is a terrible, terrible punishment. And you will go mad if you are put in solitary confinement too long. And like the people who go off in the woods, it's like they're not solitary; they're in a interesting environment.
There's beings to interact with, whether they're human or not. We're social creatures. At the end of the day,
I know somebody who was in solitary confinement for 2 weeks, which might surprise you, but I can't remember what they were arrested for. But they said it was hellish. Yeah. So I mean that makes me think of the Christchurch terrorist. Although I'm not suggesting that we should pity him. But certainly, I actually saw him. By the way, I saw him in court because I was reporting on the what was it, the sentencing, because he didn't really have a trial and he's guilty. He's going to be there for about if he lives 50 years in virtual solitary confinement. I mean, maybe there'll be some changes, but it's hard to see. And so that's kind of worse than death in some ways because it's all over, isn't it?
Yeah. At what point does that become
that is
cruel and unusual? Yeah. Does that qualify for cruel and unusual punishment?
There was a point that I heard about it, that if they put him in any sort of communal facility, he would die because whoever killed him would get so much street cred that it would be worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the same with the pedophiles in the criminal system. They're protected by the state, and the criminals can't touch them, but they do sometimes because they know that, okay, I will pay a heavy price for this, but everyone else is going to be super chuffed about it, even including the people who are supposed to be protecting them. In the case of someone like him, it's like, there's no way in hell that someone's not going to take that.
Yeah, absolutely. They're going to. What happened to O.J. Simpson when he got in jail?
I have no idea.
Somebody. I know that Peter, because I sometimes watch these documentaries like true crime. The Yorkshire Ripper. There was a very good documentary on Netflix actually about him, which me and my wife watched, and we found it very. It's very lots of archival stuff. It's very interesting how it's handled. A case study in failure, but also brilliant individual police work with cultural failings that were happening. But somebody stamped him in the eye and blinded him. He had a budge. He had a thing. That was Berkowitz as well. The Sam killer had that a lot. So these big, high-profile people, they definitely become targets. Luckily, I don't think I'm at any risk of ending up in a prison cell, becoming a high-profile target. But it would be pretty hellish. The term nonce, which is a British slang, which is pretty much the worst thing you can be called, which means not in normal something environment, I think. basically means a paedophile in prison. So that's where that came from. So yeah, it is one of the worst things that can happen, which makes me think of the Epstein thing, because Jesus, that's a nice.
Yeah, you don't want to be on that list.
Yeah, that's slowly coming out.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Like I was saying to Michael the other day, that I mean, even in my relatively limited knowledge of intelligence, how intelligence services behave, from reading bits and pieces and occasionally, having interesting chats with people, it does seem that sexual blackmail is absolutely standard fare. It's something that the Russians do. It's something that the French, Brits, Americans, Chinese do all the time, and it's not that uncommon. But what's interesting about Epstein, is the scale at which he was doing it and who he was actually ultimately working for. I mean, because it seems obvious to me that there was an intelligence aspect to it. I mean, it's just obvious.
That's why it was such a convoluted story.
Yeah, but whether it's Lex. Oh God, what's the name of the guy who was with Victoria's Secret and the links there? I find these things darkly fascinating. But yeah, no. So the organised crime element of it, and the link between organised crime and intelligence is another.
Yeah, that's another one.
Thing. I don't think we have a large amount of organised crime here.
I get the feeling that nothing's going to happen with it.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be a lot of smoke and fire and convictions ever. We've had that a few times before.
We've got about as far as we can go without the kind of third rail, being crossed.
Yeah, we've stepped on an intelligence operation, and they're not going to reveal it, regardless of the public scrutiny. And the public doesn't know how to get outraged anymore anyway. We're not going to change political pressure. No one's protesting over it.
Remember
things for Epstein.
And people forget because so many things happen. Do you remember? I mean, a lot of people. I was watching the Adam Friedland show, or was it that? Or was another one? But that's a particularly entertaining one. There was another one that I was watching, and they were talking about, and it was like, oh yeah, shit, I forgot this happened. So the judge who was presiding over something to do with Ghislaine Maxwell, somebody tried to shoot her up, and it was in the news, and then it came out, and we're not exactly sure who they were. They showed up at a house or whatever.
Yeah,
there were all these weird things. So it's kind of like, oh shit, that's really suspicious, and then it's gone.
And they hit her daughter or something that shot through the door and hit someone else.
I thought it was they shot his son.
Yeah, there we go. That sounds about right.
Absolutely not. And it's gone, and we're not sure about. Then the fact that the plea deal that Alan Dershowitz, the lawyer, was involved in, other people, to protect against other co-conspirators. I mean, that is very suspicious. They were talking to one of the people who literally goes on TV and is like one of the big skeptics who was talking on Joe Rogan, and he was saying, oh yeah, the fact that Epstein died and the cameras didn't work, and then people were, oh yeah, that's probably a conspiracy. Like, he's the sort of guy who normally goes, no, this is the flaw in your particular theory, to people who come up with JFK or the moon landing or whatever. But he was like, no, that sounds like an actual conspiracy. So yeah, I mean, that's a genuinely weird one. So it's interesting. And so I saw a thing on Reddit the other day, which is really interesting, which is I'm on the Epstein Reddit thing. I like to read the various comments that people make. It's interesting. Somebody said, would you rather Ghislaine Maxwell walk free and then said everything that you knew, or she spends the rest of her life in prison? And part of me was like, yeah, well, I'd rather
first one.
Because
yeah, we need justice.
But like that presupposes that she's free to talk. She might just get killed,
Oh, probably, but I think it'd be worth the risk.
It would certainly be very interesting.
Yeah, we don't have a system of justice that is able to play that case without being, influenced by its corruption. Unfortunately, we do not have. As horrifying as it may sound, the least corrupt court we have is the one of public opinion, which is not comforting at all. But at least we have that. I mean, in the age of the internet, that's better than nothing. A lot better than it used to be.
Something I did hear about
as well
justice. Something I heard. It's a bit of a segue, so we might to go back before we explore this one if we do, but something I heard about justice prevailing recently, or at least steps towards that happening, was someone having done all their homework and bringing the evidence forward, was bringing a case of conspiracy to commit fraud and committing fraud and all those things for people putting the wrong cause of death on death certificates, putting things like fentanyl overdoses as COVID deaths in a certain state. And they had a large number of COVID death certificates which had been falsely attributed, which were bulking up the numbers. And
well, it was fraud. They were being paid for putting them down as COVID deaths in many jurisdictions. So if they did that and it was not actually that was fraud, legitimately.
Yeah, because the hospital's got more money.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Incentives were kind of set up that way.
I'll have to have a look for it, yeah.
Yeah, so it sort of comes down to, okay, who's at fault here? The individual doctor who's like, oh, my clinic could use some more money, or the people who set up the system that provided the incentive to shift the numbers, which is the bigger problem. Like, I feel like going after the doctors themselves is kind of a scapegoat kind of way. I mean, I get it's big that it's in the public eye, but I don't think we should punish the individuals.
Show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. So I think a lot of things, and this is the importance of being nuanced and being careful, is that a lot of things are just institutionally driven or structurally driven by the way that people behave. Because like we've all done various jobs, people are just trying to get by, get the work done, go home, and if certain behaviours are normalised, or we're not aware that something's going on, or it's a close call, I mean, lots of things can happen. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually de facto sort of organised conspiracy, but it can produce, if you like, conspiratorial consequences. And
yeah,
you kind of see that a lot as well.
Does it matter if it was planned or not? If you're just pointing as a person on the ground, being like, "Hey, it seems that all of the cultural forces are going in this way," and everyone's going, you conspiracy theorist. It doesn't matter if like Rothberg's behind it or if it's just an emergent property. It's still a good thing to point and go, "Hey, we all seem to be going in this snowball direction. Like maybe that's not good."
Yeah, I think the various forces at work. I mean, I would definitely attribute it to immersion. It's an interesting thing. I mean, so people talk about stuff like the deep state, for example. I met somebody who held a term when I was in San Francisco, called Peter Dale Scott, who was sort of the respectable end of, like, he was an academic, but a respectable end of some of the sort of so-called conspiracy kind of community. And his description of it was more like a weather system, when you have different parts coming together at different times and then separating, when there are aligned interests and things like that. But also the way that works is it tips things. People use their influence to move forward their agendas based on riding a crest of the wave, stuff's already happening, etc. Or groups make certain interventions. A lot of that's kind of overtly happening in the political world. You can track it, and then there are other things that are happening. But it's a bit more complex than it being single organised things. And yet then there are conspiracies that do happen. So there are genuine conspiracies that happen. I mean, for example, people who study the September 1999 apartment bombings in Moscow, it now seems that there's quite a lot of, at least prima facie, evidence that the successor agency, the KGB, blew up people in their beds and murdered them so that they could have an excuse to attack Chechnya again, and things like that. And so these things do happen, but normally they cock up quite easily. Like, people get caught. So, but a lot of things as well are a combination of different forces interacting at a certain time, and that can be by chance, and then people seize the moment to.
I think the conspiracy theory conversation is a really interesting one that we don't touch on too much, because everyone's sort of on one side or the other. They're like, I believe in this thing, or that's complete bullshit, it's a conspiracy. And people seem to miss the fact that they're walking around spouting an axiom. Like, I believe this thing 100% without any doubt. And then anytime someone criticizes them, they go, and attack them. For the people who are spouting the mainstream view, and for the people who are spouting the conspiracy theory view. And I think it's really important, particularly for skeptical people, to realize that everyone has one thing, probably more, that they are 100% believing without ever having thought about it. That they just take on faith and on axiom. Like the guy you were talking about in your show, who's like generally critical thinker, trying to be really balanced, and then someone found the one thing, and he went, no, 100% this. I'm not going to think about it ever. That's done. And then it's like, okay, you found a pillar that your whole personality is sitting on, and it's something you've never looked at. And as people who pride themselves on being free thinkers, it's really important to try and find those. Go, oh, actually, this was something that I just accepted as dogma, whether it was a conspiracy theory or whether it was the news media's talking point, whichever.
This might be slightly irrelevant.
Yep.
In terms of what we were discussing before, I found the cause of death fraud thing, and I've put it in the chat below this video conference call, so you can look at it later. It's a Substack where someone's quoted some legal document. Someone's 6 staff members from a state Department of Health have been referred to Attorney General's Office of Criminal Prosecution. Analysis of about 460,000 death certificates from 2015 through 2022 indicate medical examiners engaged in fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and illegally falsifying public documents. 80 to 90% of the COVID-labelled deaths in Massachusetts were fraudulently entered as COVID when COVID had no causal relationship to the deaths, someone said.
Good to see this kind of
So what do they think?
Hundreds of deaths labelled COVID-19 were actually due to fentanyl overdose, blunt force trauma, or the so-called COVID vaccines defined as genetic therapies by the FDA. That's another can of worms, but it is let the light shine and let the truth out, whatever that truth is.
Yeah, like the people who go, no, you can't question that because it's too important to the state narrative. You're not allowed to question vaccines, 100% safe and effective every time. And it's like,
I'm pretty open on it. I'll tell you one thing that
go.
Is it Liz Gunn or like going 1 million people died in New Zealand? It's like, no, see now that people would fucking notice, right?
I want a good meme about
that was just like, so she has, she ain't exactly, a credible source. So
if I say it on TV, people will believe it.
I've got a friend who works in the NHS, and she was saying, so her view was, okay, so this is a fairly kind of, her view was that there were a lot more people having negative reactions to the, this is not my view because I don't know, this was her view as an NHS person, that a lot of people having like weird stuff, like not blood clots, but like weird stuff, and old people in particular, reaction to the vaccine, and it wasn't really being covered to the extent that it could, but she still thought on balance it was much safer to get it, that it decreased the number of deaths. There we go. And I think the problem is as well is that when you are government faith, this is why I resist the idea of it being a conspiracy per se by the government. And I don't necessarily think it's a conspiracy at all, but there might be a conspiracy, a kind of informal one, to kind of not address relatively higher than reported levels of bad reactions because you're disincentivized to it, right? Because the thing is, for the government, they've got a series of policy options. What are they? Let it run rampant and try and get herd immunity. What if the hospitals get overwhelmed? Then what are the downstream effects on on those things, right? You've got somebody like Jacinda, who I think all her instincts are whether you think it's misguided or not, and especially in terms of how it impacts businesses and the economy, try and save lives. And I think genuinely she's a compassionate person, but you've got to have that can also lead people, as it were, astray. And I think her reaction there was, to go hard and trying to. Also, it was very good because it was giving her political capital with the lockdowns, to focus on the public health controls and all of that. But you're massively disincentivized then from acknowledging possible side effects that actually are really bad. And again, I don't know. I'm just exploring the idea. If you've got a solution ready made, which is, well, we've got these vaccines, and because they were, what's the word for it, fast tracked. It's a lot harder to because normally they take a way longer time. They do all these tests,
Yeah.
you know what I mean. So it's quite possible that's the case. But the question is severity of it, whether or not that the number of deaths that Liz Gunn is only implying, which obviously is ridiculous, or in fact actually it's a margin which is a lot higher than people are comfortable with, but that's kind of being suppressed for a sort of networked effect of people just not wanting to address it.
This is the problem with having a narrative. Like, you have a narrative in the culture, and now everyone will have to follow it or oppose it. Once particularly for the state, once they've put their flag in the ground, it's very, very hard to turn the ship and go, oh, actually, we were wrong about that, because then they lose their political capital and all of that crap. But for people during that time, I think it's important because we all sort of talk about this like we're on one side or the other, not meaning us, but most people. And you got to remember that every human being who wasn't, starving in Africa had to deal with this, with whatever their local political situation was, whatever the restrictions and the response was, or the requirements, and people had to make their choices. And we can't be down or blaming on people, Okay, for me, I was on the risky side and I went, fuck it all, I'm not doing any of it. And early on, it seemed rather a dangerous move. There was a lot of fear, a lot of concern, and a lot of bad news coming out really fast. And, I sort of stuck to it and held to it. And at this point, we've got all this data coming out, and I'm going, okay, I seem to have made what I thought at the time was the right choice, not judging people who made different ones. But it's all well and good to look back and say you should have done X, you should have done Y, but everyone on the planet was scared. Governments included, TV announcers included, people kept their mouth shut, people did what they were told because they were afraid. And we shouldn't be. If we want the truth to come out, we should be ready to forgive people who lied. If we're going to sit here and go, no, we're going to prosecute the people who did all this wrong shit, fuck, they are going to fight till they die to keep it a secret. And why wouldn't they? Because if the world itself decided that they were going to punish the people who made mistakes or inaccuracies or hid something for one of the greatest global catastrophes we've had in a long time, that's a massive punishment, even just socially. You'd be ridiculously incentivized to hide it. But if everyone says, like, look,
I mean, if there
we all made our choices.
If there were like mass there, it would.
Sorry, I think you cut out for that.
You'll have to start again.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no. I was saying if there were deaths at the scale that suggesting, who are very anti the vaccine, I don't see how that wouldn't have gotten out on some level. Just as a sort of heuristic for me, because it contain a relatively open environment, things at that level, you might say, well, the media doesn't want to report on it. And as, by the way, still functioning journalist who's written for various publications, I don't think. What I do see is editors, for example, just being very cautious. By doing something that might seem, a bit wacky, and that sort of thing. So that's something that's incentivized by the job, but it's certainly not. I mean, again, perhaps I'm naive and I don't know, but pretty confident that at least at good publications, there's nothing like that. No, I mean, I think possible from the vaccines. It's possible that would be something that will not leak out in places where it's a lot more chaotic. But I think where you have an organized regime of health professionals, sooner or later, some hint of that would have come out more than it has already. Not paying attention, I've got a blind spot, I don't know. I'm relatively open-minded. I mean, I certainly will consider the idea that reactions to the scene then are probably reported. But I don't. It's really just a matter of scale. Like, is it like enormous numbers, or is it like a scary margin, but a relatively?
I didn't want to. I wasn't trying to go after the vaccine injury thing specifically. Like, yes, that is a thing, and lots of people are concerned. But even just for, say, a particular government official over-exaggerated numbers to try and manipulate the public to do something that would be better for the response, or or Pfizer hiding away some of the data to be like, we know we haven't tested this enough, and we're not going to say that. We're going to say it's good, just because they don't want the adverse reactions of people going like, well, I'm not going to do it, and then that's bad for health. All with the best intentions.
That's perfect.
But yeah, if you come after people with a mob, they're going to run away. And if we want the truth, yeah, we'll get it eventually either way. But it would be really nice if there was an environment such that people could come out and be like, look, we fucked up. We hid this, we hid that. This is why, we can sort of understand that things were stressful and we were all scared that everyone was going to die. And then maybe we could have a healing moment. Obviously you get to the problem of our culture is very psyched about ripping people's throats out over anything. And this is like the biggest political fight we've had in a very long time, so I doubt that's going to happen. But I don't know. It'd be nice to have some olive branches from both sides.
I totally agree that if you like a sort of amnesty and truth and reconciliation.
There's actually a sign down the road.
The most civilized way.
On the way out of this town, there's a sign on the side of the highway that says "For or against, don't let it divide New Zealand." But it doesn't specify what issue.
Sure.
It just says "For or against, don't let it divide us." And I really love that because, yes, we all know what that's for. But at the same time, it's such a great message of everyone's always going to disagree on things, but that doesn't mean you need to slit each other's throats for it. Everyone's trying to make things better. Even if you think they're wrong, they're still trying to make things better. They're not your enemy. We have real enemies, and they're out there, and we talked a lot about them at the start of this episode. We need to be focusing more on that than, these squabbles that we have. Well,
at the same
it's going to
time,
happen either way.
it feels really weird to be the one arguing this side of it, where normally often it's been the other way around, you having the more aggressive view, but there needs to be some both carrot and stick type response to encourage the truth coming out sooner next time.
Mm.
And certainly I agree that perfect is the enemy of good. If you lambast people for making mistakes in a harsh and stressful, rapidly changing environment, that's definitely the wrong choice. At the same time, pointing out this person actively hid information or actively combated investigations and the idea of investigation into things that it would have been right to do so at the time, and he received big kickbacks from the pharmaceutical company that received tons of profit, like people who did it for money.
Yeah, I'm all for that. I think probably the distinction here is social backlash. We need to be forgiving of politicians who made choices, because they made choices. But people in the corporate world who broke laws, they need to be punished for sure.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, people like Fauci spring to the top of mind. And then, there's the Eco Health Alliance and all of that. And it's like, okay, you can't just get away with that, lining your pockets and potentially killing millions. It's all well and good to waffle about, this response or that response in the vaccine. But when it comes to like, oh, you made it in the first place and we funded it with government money, it's like, allegedly, I know. Mr. Journalist. But
Yeah, I saw
there's a lot of concern there.
I'm going to have to go in a moment, but I'll just quickly mention this. So going back to the beginning of where it was made and accidentally escaped, and or it's zoonotics that came from an animal, and somebody in sanitary conditions somewhere, or whatever chain of transmission and so on. Uh, what we do know, even though the lab is plausible, I'm not dismissing the viral. But what we do know is that China did know that it was human-to-human transmission and let it spread. And there was 2 crucial weeks in which it might not have spread. So, I mean, that is known. That's an open source fact. And then, in fact, there were not come out and say it was, that it was, that it was a pandemic, and not to enforce measures that would shut down flight from China. So, I mean, that there you go. That's clear. So we know that. So millions of people are dead. The Eco Health Alliance thing is kind of interesting. I don't know. It is a story that Peter Dad, who's is the Anglo-American fellow who was the head of Eco. Like he was initially involved in some WHO thing where he's got complete conflicts of interest, if I recall correctly, and he actually sent a letter to Nature, which is one of these journals that people say something respect, organizing a group of people, of probably we're trying to say, oh, it didn't come from a lab. Blah, blah, blah. I even saw stuff online and it really annoyed me because it's a real abuse of anti-racist language to say this. They were saying, oh, it's racist to say that COVID came from a lab. It's like, how is that racist? It's either a fact or it isn't. Yeah, it's interesting how there are some of these disincentives that are floating about. But one of the things that stands out for me is like coronavirus is actually relatively easygoing compared to some of the viruses that could come along, engineered or organically, and it's given us a real stress test. And that's another thing that we can all worry.
Yep, desktop printers and AI helping you create super viruses.
As wake-up calls go, it was a gentle wake-up call, as it could go.
Yeah, so far.
Yeah, compared to something like the bubonic plague.
Yeah, it could be really bad. We all waffled about like these lockdowns are unacceptable and you can't take away our freedoms like that for this. But if it was like 50% lethality, yeah, go for it. Like, shut us down immediately, please. I don't care how bad the economy's done. Like, you have to do it. But 2%, it's like a flu. 50%, yeah, no doubt. Just want to say, like, thanks for coming on. It's been great chat.
Yeah.
I actually hope that we can do this again because there was a couple of things I wanted to ask you about that we didn't get to. You sort of hinted at.
No, please. I'm quite open. Yeah. I'm interested to hear about that gold mine. Yeah, as well.
It was just something like an off comment I heard from a workmate. So I don't actually know much about that personally, but I'll have a look into it at some point. I'm sure Michael will. He's Mr. Research. But yeah, you mentioned offhand a few things that I'd like to touch on. The whole peak oil thing would be great to discuss that because I'm not on that train at all. I'm not a collapsing person. I was, which is why I'm down in the middle of nowhere, but I'm actually not anymore. And if you're okay with it, I would like to ask you about parenting and how things are going with your children, because that's fascinating to me. An interesting story and a lot to learn there. I do. I have 3 daughters, very, very young.
Wow.
Yeah, all under 4. And I think I'd like to ask you about politics too, because I feel like you dropped a few comments here and there in the background that raised red flags in my mind, which could be rather spicy and entertaining. But all round, it's nice to meet another person who's, well, nuanced I thought,
Thank you.
of course. Yeah. Thank you, Michael. That pops up on my phone.
Yeah, I just
Thank
I
you.
put the link to the videos that I've watched recently about peak oil and the latest developments and arguments and rebuttals going back and forward. A spirit similar to this of I might be wrong, but here's the best I can think, and here's where I think you got it wrong type discussion.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I love stuff like that. I mean, I'll give you one example, just going to how information and how we cognitively process it and how it can be convincing, right? So the decision making is, I've got a mate of mine who's like really passionate about everything and politics and this, that, and the other. And he changes his mind. He's gone from being like super duper far left to being kind of more centrist and a little bit conservative on things. Anyway, so he was quite big into conspiracies at one point, and he said he had this experience in his mind about how easy it is, how challenging it can be to process information because of all the filters that we naturally have, cognitive biases, and the way that people can present them. So with the moon landing, right, I read a thing where a bloke cherry picked different bits of information and just lined it all up, like, oh, the flag wasn't doing this, oh, there was this sort of thing, and it was just a perfect sort of capsule of information. Sorry, oh, one of my kids is. Oh, I've got to go.
No worries. Anyway, it was great having you. We'll see everyone next week, and hopefully we'll be joined again by you soon. Great fun, though.
Thank you. I'll do some research.
I won't.
No, please do. Sorry, one of my kids. Okay.
Yeah, no worries. Great to meet you, man.